She thought she was in control. That's what made it so shocking when the HOA's self-appointed enforcer barged onto my property, shouting rules and threats like she owned the place. At first, I stayed quiet, letting her rant, watching her confidence swell with every word. But what she didn't know, what she couldn't possibly have imagined, was that the person sitting across from me wasn't just another neighbor. It was someone who held more power in a single signature than she'd ever dreamed of having. And the moment she crossed that line, her fate was sealed. The only question left was, how far would her downfall go? Before everything spiraled into chaos, life by the lake was almost picture perfect. My cabin sat tucked between tall pines, the kind that swayed with the wind like a natural lullaby, and the mornings were quiet enough to hear the ripple of fish breaking the water's surface. For years, this little slice of the world had been my escape, a place where the noise of the city melted away and time seemed to slow down. It wasn't glamorous, but it was mine. I'd mow the grass on weekends, sip coffee on the porch, and watch the seasons roll by without much thought about what came next. The neighborhood itself was a mix of retirees, weekend vacationers, and a handful of year-round residents. People waved when they drove by, offered polite smiles at the general store, and mostly kept to themselves. It wasn't the kind of place you moved to for excitement. It was where you went to breathe. And for the most part, that suited me just fine. I liked the quiet. I liked the sense that everyone had their own corner of peace, and nobody needed to step on anyone else's toes. At least, that's how it was supposed to be. But underneath the postcard scenery, a different kind of rhythm pulsed through the community. An HOA board, small on paper but oversized in ego, had carved out its own little kingdom of rules. They were the type of people who took pride in measuring mailbox heights, in counting how many times your grass grew an inch too tall, in noticing whether your deck stain matched the approved palette. For a while, I brushed it off. After all, every neighborhood had its quirks, right? And as long as they stayed out of my business, I'd stay out of theirs. Still, there was one name that kept cropping up, whispered in annoyance during casual conversations. Karen. She wasn't officially the president, but she acted like she ran the entire association. If she spotted a flower pot that wasn't HOA approved, she'd send a notice. If she thought your trash bins lingered too long at the curb, she'd snap a picture as evidence. People said she relished confrontation, that she carried a binder full of bylaws like a sheriff with a badge. I had never had a run-in with her myself, and honestly, I figured if I kept to my corner, I'd never have to. That's the funny thing about people like Karen. You don't go looking for them. They come looking now for you. And when they do, they don't just knock politely on your door. They barge straight through, ready to declare their authority, whether you asked for it or not. For me, the calm before the storm was deceptively ordinary. I spent my mornings with coffee and a notebook, jotting down ideas, listening to loons call across the lake. I stacked firewood, fixed squeaky hinges, and enjoyed the quiet. But little did I know, those simple routines were about to be interrupted by the kind of chaos only an HOA power trip can deliver. The cabin I had always thought of as my safe retreat was about to become ground zero in a battle I never wanted, one that would expose just how far petty authority could reach and how quickly peace could shatter. Because in this neighborhood, it wasn't enough to live quietly. Someone always had to prove they were in charge. And when that someone finally set their sights on me, everything I thought I knew about life by the lake was turned upside down. It started small, almost laughably so. A letter tucked into my mailbox, printed on official HOA stationery, pointed out that the trim on my cabin was the wrong shade of brown. According to them, it didn't fall within the pre-approved palette, a set of colors so narrow you'd think they were designing a prison instead of a lakeside community. At first, I chuckled, shook my head, and tossed it onto the counter. Who cared if my trim leaned more chestnut than walnut? It wasn't like anyone was out here with a paint swatch comparing siding to bylaws. But 2 days later, Another letter appeared. This time it wasn't a notice, it was a warning. Same trim issue, but now with a demand to repaint within 30 days or face a fine. Suddenly, what felt like nitpicking had teeth, and I knew exactly whose fingerprints were all over it. Karen. Neighbors had warned me about her. They'd told me stories about how she once filed a complaint over someone's flower pots because they weren't neutral enough, how she measured a man's shed with a tape measure to make sure it didn't exceed height restrictions, and how she had a knack for using the HOA's rulebook like a weapon. Still, I hadn't thought she'd come for me so soon. My cabin was far enough off the beaten path that I could slip under her radar. Clearly, I was wrong. The fines rolled in like clockwork. $50 for the trim, another $100 because my firewood stack wasn't shielded from view, $200 because I left my canoe propped against a tree instead of locked in a shed. Each one came with a deadline, a warning, and a thinly veiled threat. Pay up, comply, or else. At first, I tried to brush it off. The cabin was my retreat, not my battlefield, but ignoring her didn't make her back down. It made her push harder. Within weeks, she escalated from letters to unannounced visits. I'd glance up from the porch and see her striding across the yard, binder in hand, eyes darting like a hawk searching for infractions. She'd mutter about weeds, about gravel on the driveway, about community standards, as if she'd personally written them. The worst part wasn't the fines or the letters. It was the feeling that I was being watched, that no matter how small the detail, Karen was lurking, ready to twist it into a violation. I'd catch myself second-guessing everything. Should I leave the canoe out? Did I mow too close to the line? Was my porch light too bright? Living at the cabin was supposed to be peaceful, but it was starting to feel like living under surveillance. And just when I thought it couldn't get worse, it did. One Saturday morning, I walked outside to find a neon notice slapped onto my front door in bold red letters, "Non-compliance, final warning." The words hit me like a punch. According to the notice, if I didn't repaint the trim within 14 days, the HOA would not only fine me daily but would also take corrective action themselves and bill me for it. Translation: they'd hire someone to repaint my cabin, probably at triple the cost, and leave me with the bill. That was the moment I realized this wasn't about rules. This was about power. Karen didn't care about the shade of brown on my trim. She cared about control, about showing she could bend people to her will, one notice at a time. And she had chosen me as her following example. What she didn't know was that I wasn't the type to roll over. And the more she pushed, the more complex something inside me seemed to harden. If she wanted a fight, she was about to get one. But before I could even begin to push back, Karen made her boldest move yet, one that would cross a line so outrageous, even the neighbors who usually stayed silent would start whispering. And that move came late one night, when I least expected it. It was just past midnight when I heard it, the crunch of gravel outside my cabin. At first, I thought it was an animal, maybe a deer wandering too close. But then came the sound of footsteps, deliberate and heavy, moving toward the porch. My chest tightened. Nobody had any business being out here at that hour. I flicked on the porch light, and there she was, Karen, standing on my steps with a flashlight and her ever-present binder. She didn't flinch at the light. She didn't even look surprised. Instead, she barked something about safety checks and community compliance. My jaw dropped. Safety checks? At midnight? She wasn't just pushing boundaries anymore, she was breaking them. That night set off a chain of events that made the letters and fines look like child's play. Karen started targeting me with precision. Every week, a new violation notice appeared. My canoe was visible from the lake and created an eyesore. My wood pile was a fire hazard, despite being stacked neatly. Even the wind chimes on my porch were unapproved outdoor modifications. Each notice came with a fine, and each fine piled higher on the stack of absurdity. By the end of the month, The total had ballooned into the thousands. It wasn't about money anymore. It was harassment, plain and simple. I tried reasoning with the HOA board, but they were no help. Some nodded sympathetically, others shuffled papers nervously, but nobody dared challenge Karen. She had a grip on them. Whether through intimidation or sheer persistence, I couldn't tell. Either way, I was on my own. The tension spread through the community like wildfire. Neighbors who once waved now avoided eye contact, afraid of being seen as associates. Others whispered warnings, stories of families who had been fined into submission, who had repainted, rebuilt, or even sold their homes to escape. It was as if Karen thrived on fear, and fear was keeping everyone silent, but not me. I wasn't about to let her win. One morning, I snapped. A fresh notice had arrived, claiming my porch railing was 2 inches too high. 2 inches. I held the paper in my hands, and for the first time I laughed. Not because it was funny, but because it was so ridiculous, so beyond reason, that it felt like a parody of itself. That laugh was the crack in the dam, the moment frustration turned into determination. I started documenting everything, every notice, every late-night visit, every petty rule she tried to weaponize. I took photos, recorded videos, and kept logs of dates and times. If she wanted to play this game, I would build the record that showed the world exactly how far she was willing to go. And then came the meeting. The one where Karen, in all her self-righteous glory, stood before the board and rattled off a list of my so-called violations. She droned on about bylaws, about community standards, about protecting property values. But she didn't notice the shift in the room. The way some board members exchanged uneasy glances, the way neighbors whispered in the back, because by then, her obsession with me had become too obvious, too extreme. And people were starting to wonder, if she could do this to me, who would be next? Still, Karen wasn't finished. She had one more move up her sleeve, one that would turn everything upside down, one that would make every petty fine, every notice, every sleepless night look like child's play. And when she played it, she had no idea who was sitting across from me, and just how much power they had to bring her empire of pettiness crashing down. The moment that tipped everything into chaos didn't come with a polite knock or a neatly typed letter. It came with the crash of a door handle slamming against wood, the echo of boots on my porch, and the sharp, grating voice of Karen filling my cabin like an alarm bell. She hadn't come alone this time. She brought 2 board members, both wide-eyed and awkward, like reluctant deputies dragged into a showdown they didn't want. And in her hand was a clipboard thick with papers, the so-called evidence of my refusal to comply. Her words cut through the air like knives. "You've ignored every notice. You've rejected every warning. By the authority of this association, we're escalating to forced corrective action. Consider this your final chance to comply before legal enforcement begins." I might have argued. Usually I might have tried to reason, but not that day. Not in that moment. Because sitting across from me at my kitchen table was someone who changed the stakes entirely. The state attorney general. I didn't introduce them. I didn't need to. The attorney general sat silently, watching Karen with a steady gaze that made even her bluster falter for a split second. But true to form, Karen overlooked the danger she was walking into. She doubled down, flipping through. Her papers, rattling off fines, code numbers, and threats like bullets from a machine gun. I let her talk. Every word was a nail in her own coffin. She accused me of damaging community values. She claimed my non-compliance was lowering the property's worth. She even threatened to have contractors repaint my cabin at my expense, adding a clause about legal fees that would triple the cost. The Attorney General finally spoke, his voice calm but edged with steel. "Ma'am, could you repeat that last part?" Karen snapped her head up, visibly irritated that someone had interrupted her performance. "I said we will enforce compliance by entering his property, making the changes ourselves, and billing him for all costs incurred." That is within our rights under the association bylaws. A pause followed, heavy, deliberate. The Attorney General leaned forward, clasped his hands, and asked one question that sliced the tension like a blade. Are you aware of the state laws that govern private property rights and restrict unauthorized entry? Karen blinked, caught off guard. But her pride wouldn't let her back down. This is an HOA matter. Our bylaws supersede his objections. We have full authority to enforce compliance. The room went dead silent. Even the two board members shifted uncomfortably, their faces draining of color. And then came the moment, the turning point I'd been waiting for. The Attorney General pulled a folder from his briefcase, set it on the table, and began reading aloud. Statute numbers, case precedents, sections of law that spelled out in black and white exactly how wrong Karen was. Not just bad, dangerously wrong. What she described wasn't enforcement. It was trespassing. It was harassment. It was an abuse of power. Each word landed like a hammer. Karen tried to interrupt, tried to wave her binder like a shield. Still, the Attorney General's voice cut through her protests with the weight of authority she couldn't match. He outlined potential civil penalties, liability for damages, and even the possibility of criminal charges if she or anyone from the HOA attempted to enter my property without consent. The color drained from Karen's face. For the first time since this war began, she wasn't smirking. She wasn't barking. She wasn't in control. She stood there, binder trembling in her hands, while the very foundation of her petty empire cracked beneath her feet. The board members glanced at each other, then at me, then back at the Attorney General. One of them finally spoke, his voice low and nervous. I wasn't aware it was that serious. We never agreed to breaking the law. But Karen couldn't let go. She stammered about bylaws, about precedent, about her authority. She even accused me of weaponizing the state against the community, as if I had orchestrated this entire moment to humiliate her. And in a way, maybe I had, not by design, but by refusing to bow to her intimidation. The Attorney General closed his folder and stood. His final words landed like a verdict. This association has overstepped its legal boundaries. Any further harassment or unauthorized entry will result in immediate legal action. Consider this your official warning. The silence that followed was deafening. Karen's mouth opened, but no words came out. Her binder slipped slightly in her grip, papers spilling across the floor in a messy pile that mirrored the collapse of her authority. The board members stepped back, distancing themselves from her as though proximity alone might drag them into deeper trouble. I watched it all unfold, a storm of emotions churning inside me, anger, vindication, disbelief. For months, I had been harassed, fined, and pushed to the edge. And now, in a single confrontation, the tables had turned so completely that Karen stood exposed, powerless and cornered by the very system she thought she controlled. She tried one last tactic, a desperate attempt to salvage her crumbling power. "This isn't over," she hissed, pointing a shaking finger at me. "You can't hide behind him forever. The community will see what you've done." But even as the words left her mouth, they rang hollow. The board members weren't nodding in support. They weren't backing her up. They were edging toward the door, eager to escape the sinking ship. The Attorney General left the cabin with a promise to follow up formally, his presence like a shield that left Karen floundering in the wreckage. And when the door closed behind him, the silence that settled over the room was unlike anything I'd heard before. It wasn't peace. It was the sound of a tyrant realizing the kingdom she'd built on fear was crumbling, brick by brick. For the first time, Karen had no power. No binder full of rules could save her. No empty threats could silence me. And as she stood in my cabin, surrounded by the evidence of her own arrogance, I couldn't help but feel a grim satisfaction. The war wasn't finished yet. There were still Battles to fight, consequences to unfold, fallout to endure. But in that moment, one thing was clear. The tide had turned. And Karen? She had finally met a wall she couldn't bulldoze through. The only question now was how far the cracks in her empire would spread, and how many people would be standing beside her when it all came crashing down. When the Attorney General's car disappeared down the gravel road, the weight in the air shifted. It wasn't gone, not yet, but lighter, like a storm that had finally broken and left behind a silence charged with aftershocks. Karen stood frozen in the middle of my living room, binder clutched against her chest like a life vest in rough seas. But it wouldn't save her now. The two board members had already edged toward the door, muttering excuses about needing to check. In with the others. They couldn't escape fast enough. Karen lingered, her face pale, her lips pressed thin. For someone who thrived on control, on bluster, and on barking orders, she looked stripped bare. I half expected her to launch into another tirade, to spit out one last volley of threats. But nothing came. She finally gathered her papers in a trembling hand, muttered something I couldn't make out, and stormed out the door. I stood there, stunned by the abruptness of it all. For months, she had hounded me with fines, warnings, and late-night intrusions, and in one afternoon, it all came crashing down. I didn't feel triumphant, not immediately. What I felt was relief, the kind of relief that sinks deep into your bones after you've been carrying a burden for too long. But the real fallout, I would soon learn, was only beginning. The very next week, the Attorney General's office sent formal notices to the HOA board. They weren't vague or friendly. They were direct, loaded with citations, and heavy with implications. The board was instructed to cease all unauthorized enforcement actions immediately, to review their bylaws for legal compliance, and to submit documentation proving their activities were in line with state law. The whispers started spreading through the neighborhood almost instantly. People who had been silent for years suddenly found their voices. At the general store, on the lake docks, even in the church parking lot, conversations shifted. Everyone had a story about the fines they'd paid, the warnings they'd endured, the quiet fear they'd lived under. The more people talked, the more they realized they weren't alone. Karen hadn't just targeted me. She'd targeted everyone, one by one, always isolating, always keeping her grip tight enough that nobody dared push back. But now, with the Attorney General involved, the curtain had been pulled back. Neighbors began comparing notes, digging out old notices, tallying up fines that had drained savings accounts or forced unnecessary renovations. The outrage spread like wildfire, and the board, once so smug and untouchable, scrambled to contain the damage. Karen, of course, fought tooth and nail to cling to her power. She called emergency meetings, distributed long-winded letters about protecting community standards, and tried to paint me as the villain who had brought outsiders into their business. But it was too late. The board members who had once backed her were now distancing themselves, terrified of personal liability. Homeowners who had lived in fear of her binder now spoke openly against her, some even threatening lawsuits of their own. The final blow came when the Attorney General's office announced a formal investigation into the HOA's practices. Not just Karen's overreach, but the entire structure, the misuse of funds, the unlawful fines, the intimidation tactics. It was bigger than her now, and she knew it. I'll never forget the sight of her at the next community meeting. For the first time, she wasn't standing tall at the front with her binder. She was slouched in a folding chair, silent, while the Attorney General's representative laid out the terms: immediate suspension of all fines, mandatory restitution to homeowners who had been unlawfully charged, and the election of a new board under state supervision. When her name came up for censure, the room erupted. Neighbors who had once avoided eye contact stood one after another to tell their stories. The time she trespassed to measure a deck, the time she humiliated a widow over her flower beds, The time she fined a family for having holiday lights. That didn't match the color scheme. Each testimony was another nail in her coffin. And then, with a vote that felt almost ceremonial, Karen was removed from the board. Just like that, the queen of petty power was dethroned. The weeks that followed felt surreal. For the first time in years, I could sit on my porch without scanning for a clipboard lurking in the shadows. I repainted nothing. I left my canoe propped against the tree. I even added another string of wind chimes, just because I could. Neighbors began stopping by, some sheepishly, to thank me. They admitted they'd been too scared to stand up to Karen, too beaten down by her relentless nitpicking. One man, his voice shaking, told me she had nearly driven him to sell his home after years of harassment. A young family confessed they'd paid thousands in bogus fines because they didn't know they had the right to fight back. It was humbling to realize that my battle hadn't been mine alone. It had been everyone's. They just hadn't been able to join the fight until someone cracked the first wall. The impact stretched beyond our little lakeside community. News of the investigation made local headlines, sparking conversations in neighboring towns about HOA overreach and abuse of power. Other communities began scrutinizing their own boards, questioning rules that had long gone unchallenged. The Attorney General's office even launched a broader initiative to monitor HOAs across the state, citing our case as a turning point. Suddenly, the whispers that had been confined to grocery store aisles and backyard fences were out in the open, loud and undeniable. And Karen? She vanished from the spotlight. Rumor had it she moved in with family in another county, too embarrassed to show her face after the investigation. Others claimed she was still trying to file complaints from afar, but nobody listened anymore. Her binder, once the symbol of fear, had become a joke, a relic of pettiness that people laughed about over beers on the dock. Standing on my porch now, I think about how close I came to giving in. How many times I almost paid the fines to make it stop. How tempting it was to repaint the trim and hope she'd move on. But giving in would have only fueled her hunger for control. What I learned, and what I hope every person watching this takes away, is that bullies, no matter how official they look, thrive on silence. They count on fear. They build their power on the belief that nobody will push back. But the moment you shine a light on their tactics, the moment you call their bluff, their power crumbles. It wasn't easy. It wasn't clean. And it sure wasn't quick. But standing my ground didn't. Just protect my cabin. It freed an entire community from the grip of one person's obsession with control. So if you've ever felt trapped by unfair rules, by harassment, by someone who thinks they hold power over you, remember this story. Remember Karen's binder, slipping to the floor, her empire collapsing under the weight of her own arrogance. And remember that even the smallest pushback can set off a chain reaction that topples giants. Because in the end, peace doesn't come from avoiding conflict. It comes from facing it, from refusing to surrender what's yours, and from proving that even the loudest bully can't drown out the truth. And as I sit here now, coffee in hand, the lake calm and quiet before me, I know one thing for sure. My cabin is mine. My rules are mine, and no binder, no fine, no midnight intrusion will ever change that again.